Hello everyone! Today I'm going to talk about how useful really is MBTI. You might think something like, is it even worth it to learn about it, to use it, and to basically categorize people, right? To put a label on people. So yeah, does MBTI really put people in boxes? Is it really going to help people, or is it only going to make people kind of being like, for example, oh, you are an ENFP, so you must be like this. And I think that this is one thing that a lot of people use to criticize MBTI. So there are 16 different personalities, and it may seem pretty simple at first. Like, there are four options. There's a four-letter code, and you're either organized or messy, or you're either smart or social, basically. Practical or more theoretical, and you're either introverted or extroverted. So if you look at the theory behind this, which is the theory based on Carl Jung's observations of people, where he has observed a lot of people, and his theory is based on a lot of observations of real people. What he observed in terms of patterns in their behavior, and what he thought could be the underlying cause for these patterns. Speculating that there are certain cognitive differences between people, brain differences, that cause these differences in behavior between people, these differences in personality. So the idea is that if you're using one brain area or multiple brain areas that are associated with a certain personality trait, so for the people who already know about this, I'm talking about the cognitive functions, it's actually focused on 8 different kind of brain functions or brain areas, but I don't think it's like necessarily one area tied to a function. It's just every function is probably tied to a few specific brain areas. The idea is that when you use one of these cognitive functions, or when you use one of these brain areas that are supposed to be tied to this cognitive function, it means that there's another brain area that is basically the exact opposite, and that you cannot use that one at the same time. So your strength is basically tied to your weakness. So the MBTI theory works, or Jung's theory works a lot with these opposites, assuming that being good at something means that automatically you're bad at something else that's the exact opposite. Because you cannot use these two brain areas basically at the same time, because they are opposing each other. So I'll put like a quote in here that hopefully makes it a bit more clear. But I think this makes a lot of sense because, of course, people kind of want to believe that everyone should be able to be perfect, right? Really good at everything. But in reality, that's not really possible. People aren't like that. People have their strengths and their weaknesses. They're never going to be good at everything. That doesn't mean that MBTI is saying something like people cannot develop. People can develop, and they can become better at their weaknesses. There's just a certain limit, there are just certain limitations. As our brains are flexible, but they are not flexible in every way. So there are certain limitations to this development. And I think that it is a lot more realistic to look at people like they have their strengths and their weaknesses, rather than looking at them like they can be perfect in every way, because the theory states that we're dealing with these opposites, that even if you were to focus on developing a certain function throughout your entire lifetime, say if you're really good at intuition and you want to develop sensing, if you're gonna try to develop sensing, you'll be able to develop it a bit more, but you will never be as good at it as someone who's naturally very good at sensing, because that's the kind of development that you can only reach when you ignore intuition. And if you're good at intuition, of course, you're not going to ignore intuition. You haven't ignored intuition. You have focused your energy on that so much that you're never going to reach the level of someone who's really good at sensing, because they have spent all their energy on developing sensing for a big part of their life. And if they were to stop doing that and focus, for example, on intuition, first of all, they'd be so bad at it that they wouldn't be able to function in their daily life until they reach a certain level of development without the help of sensing. And secondly, if they were to stop using sensing, they would end up being someone who doesn't really have a clear strength anymore and who's kind of sort of good at two different things, which means that they are probably going to struggle in life because they have no strength to rely on. People need a certain strength or certain brain areas to rely on, and I think that's the main idea behind Carl Jung's theory, that everyone has one such strength to rely on that they are better at it than average. They're better than average. So that's why I think that saying something like you can be an expert at all the functions is basically undermining the theory and it's basically impossible, because it would mean that the opposites don't exist. But the theory states that they do exist. And if that was the case, then we wouldn't even need to describe type. We probably wouldn't even see those differences, right? Because if it was so easy to be good at everything, then everyone will be good at everything already. But clearly we are observing certain differences that are more or less wired into our brains. But again, our brains are still flexible and we can still develop within certain limitations. The idea is that these personality types are, at first, they're always based on observations, but research can be done in terms of what are the underlying forces, the underlying causes for these differences in behavior, and how is that related to brain activity. And what causes that is another question, is it caused by genetics? Is it caused by more environmental factors? But either way, it's something that has to do with the brain. And in terms of MBTI, the idea is that every single type has specific brain areas that are very well developed and other ones that are a bit less developed, and that this causes differences in personality and in behavior, and that we can also develop these areas more if we try to focus on using these areas more. For anyone who's going to say something like there's nothing scientific about MBTI, I don't think that makes any sense, because there are a lot of opportunities for brain research, basically, for using things like MRI and EEG. There have been studies that used these methods and used brain research to try and figure out if there are certain differences between people who seem to show different personalities, if this could be traced back to their brain activity in any way. This is still a field of research that is relatively new, and that a lot of research could still be done in that field, and hopefully that will be done. And I think that there's definitely a lot of opportunity for doing research that's related to MBTI. There has apparently already been some research into it, but also more research has been done looking at personality traits that have to do with the big 5 personality traits, which has a bit of overlap with MBTI, but it's not the same. It defines traits that are a bit different. For example, there has been research apparently into which brain regions can possibly be correlated with certain big 5 traits, personality traits. There's also been some research doing that for MBTI traits or cognitive functions. And I think that why couldn't the same research be done for MBTI, right? It's pretty similar. It just deals with slightly different traits. And they are traits that a lot of people seem to relate to. So there might be some truth in it. There's also research into extroversion and introversion, where people are looking at brain arousal or activation, basically, and what's the threshold for stimulation of the brain. And they say that for extroverts is not as easily stimulated as for introverts, because this could explain why extroverts really like to seek out a lot of new experiences, and they want to interact with the world around them a lot. And introverts would get more easily overwhelmed, because whenever they get some kind of stimuli or input, there's a strong reaction from the brain. So they don't need a lot of input to get a strong reaction to that input, and that's why they are more focused on their internal world, on their own thoughts, rather than seeking a lot of interaction with the world around them. But yeah, anyhow, that kind of research has also been done, apparently. Of course, so the MBTI also includes introversion and extroversion as well. And, the real question is, of course, which traits do people want to use to define personality difference between people? Of course, you could use the big 5 traits. You could use the traits from Carl Jung's theory and Myers-Briggs. But whatever traits you're going to use, I think that there can be valuable research done into it. So yeah, let's talk first about the positive sides of MBTI. So why is it useful? First of all, I think that if people know their type, for example, they know exactly how they could develop themselves. It can help them to reach their full potential, There's this potential that people can reach. And if they know their type, it will be easier to reach it, because they are aware of what it is. They are aware of, this is my strength, this is my weakness, and how can I work on my weakness, and how can I become better at it? Because even when something is your natural weakness, you can still get better at it. You can still change from being really bad at it to being sort of okay at it. Even if you'll never become an expert, you can still develop your weakness. And that's one of the positive sides of personality type, is that it can really help people to develop their weaknesses and to understand what their strengths are and to use their strengths. For example, it's possible that people have certain strengths and they literally don't even realize it. When you know of the other types, you will find it a lot easier to understand people who are a very different type than your type. Because naturally, when we meet someone who's a very different type, we will just naturally kind of notice these differences and maybe think about, okay, why can't they be more like me? Or why do they approach things in such a different way than I do, And sometimes it can lead to people really misunderstanding each other and really also disliking each other, even when in reality their behavior can largely be explained by their type. And for example, I find that for me, nowadays, now I know people's type, I forgive people much more easily, because I know when someone's a certain type and, their weakness kind of shows up. I realize that, okay, that's their natural weakness. So they're naturally going to struggle with that. Whenever it does show up, I will forgive them for making a mistake in that area, because I know that the reason they still fail is because of their type, and that they can't change their type, and it's just hard for them, and it's a lot harder for them than it is for me. And for example, they'll understand when they know my type, my weaknesses, and they'll understand that, okay, that's something that I struggle with, and they'll forgive me for that, more easily, because it's so easy to think that when something's easy for you to do, that is also easy for someone else, and usually it's just not, because we have these differences in our brain functioning, and we can use these personality type like models to describe some obvious differences between people so that we can understand each other better, understand where we're coming from, understand that all these different types have their own strengths, that there's no type that's useless or that has no strength, and that once we understand that, we can really appreciate other people for their strengths and kind of be like, okay, I know this person is different from me, but I know that they're good at this thing that I'm not really good at, and I really appreciate that that's their strength, and I'm not gonna hate them for being different from me because they have their own strengths. And that doesn't mean, because I've heard some people say this as well, like that doesn't mean that personality type is about letting people get away with doing bad things, because you can't use your personality type as an excuse for being a bad person, because there is no personality type that's inherently supposed to be a bad person or a bad type. There is no type that's supposed to be like the asshole type or something, like, so you technically can't excuse bad behavior with your type, unless you have no clear understanding of the types and you have no clear understanding, in this case with MBTI, of the cognitive functions. Because when you learn about cognitive functions, you know that they can be used in various ways. They can be used in healthy ways, they can be used in unhealthy ways. Being a certain type is not an excuse to use a function in an unhealthy way. It's only an excuse to have a certain order of the functions and to have a certain limitation of development. There are so many ways to use a function that you can always learn to use your functions in a healthy way. And there's no type that is a bad type, there's no function that's a bad function. And the thing is, when you know someone's type, it's so much easier to imagine how they must feel, I can literally imagine what it's like to be certain other types and realize that they have certain struggles because of their type that I don't even deal with, Yeah, so I think the positive side is about understanding yourself, accepting yourself, developing your strengths and weaknesses, using your strengths. Sometimes people might go their whole life without even realizing what their strength is, Understanding other people, communicating with other people, working together with other people. Yeah, but of course, there are also negative sides. That is one reason why it gets a lot of criticism. Are people going to be seen not like individuals, but like just a part of a group, And then I want to say that, yes, this is a valid point of criticism. But it just depends, Are there more positives or negatives? And I think that just depends on everyone, how they experience it. For me, for example, I could never say something like, I think that MBTI is bad, it's a bad thing, because for me, it helped me a lot. It helped me so much that I couldn't possibly say that, And I think that most of the people who like to talk about MBTI, who are interested in it, probably are because it helped them a lot, And for me, if I could choose a life where I did not know about this theory, instead of knowing about it, I would never choose that life, because I would never be able to understand myself or develop myself or understand other people on the level that I can now. That I would never choose to live without this knowledge. But I understand that some people might think that they can live without it because they think that it's only gonna hurt people, because people are gonna put a label on them. And I just want to say that, like, yeah, it could potentially be dangerous, where the main problem is always gonna be that some people are gonna use it for the wrong things, right? It's always that there's a possibility that there's certain knowledge that people are going to use for the wrong thing. So I think the only challenge that we face is that we have to use this knowledge for the right thing and not for the wrong thing. And the wrong thing would be, for example, assuming, oh, you're this type, so you're gonna be exactly like this, because the whole theory is not about every type. Every person from a certain type acts the same. The only thing the theory says is that they have certain similarities in their brain functioning. But there's still a lot of different ways that this can manifest and that this can show itself in a person. You can have two, say, ESFPs who are, when you first meet them, you would never, for example, say that they're both the same type because they're acting very different. Type theory, it's not even about behavior. Yeah, it was based on observations of behavior, but the theory itself is about brain differences, which means that even if people have similar way that their brain works, they can still show very different behavior. So there are many possibilities for how two people of the same type can still be different, which means that that's one of the reasons why I feel like it's not really boxing people in, because most people who actually know a lot about the theory know this. They know that a type can look like very different depending on the person. Can we still recognize type? Often it's possible, yes. Like, yes, there are these differences. You have these types, it's just that there are 16 types, you know? And then within one type, there are like 100 different possibilities of still how that type can look, you know? And they're still gonna look different from the other type. But it's not that simple, it's not like two people are gonna be the exact same. That's not what this theory is trying to say at all. It's just that once we know a bit more about brain functioning, we will know a bit more about the person, and that doesn't mean we know everything about them. You know, that just means we know a certain basis about their brain functioning. And yeah, using this in the right way, this information is about, you know, helping people to understand which type they are, and then using it to understand them, understand where they are coming from, help them to be able to use their strength in their life, to be able to develop their weakness. And bad way to use it is, of course, to discriminate based on type, you know. And I think that that's just, it's the same as other type of discrimination, and we also had to learn to deal how to deal with that, you know. It's the same with things like racism, sexism. And secondly, I feel like knowing type doesn't change. In reality, it just doesn't change that much, because these boxes, you know, if we're gonna say something like we're putting people into boxes, these boxes are already there. Whether you want to see it or not, whether you want to work with it or not, these differences are already there. And it's the same with things like people being like left-handed or right-handed. It's like sometimes it's good to be aware of it, because of course at some point left-handed people were forced to write with their right hand. It's still gonna be a thing, whether you work with it or not. You know, people are still gonna be either left-handed or right-handed. When you know it, I mean, yeah, you could use it to discriminate people and kind of be like, left-handed people suck or something like that, you know. Or you could just accept that it's not a problem as long as you let them write with their left hand. And the same goes for introversion, extraversion. I think this is something that are now terms that are pretty well known, that some people are more introverted, some are more extroverted. And I think most people find it useful to know that, because the only thing that changed is you have a term for it, but it was always still there. People would just call it differently. And when there's going to be research into it, then there's going to be more information available and people will understand better what it's really about. So for example, if the terms didn't exist, people will still see the differences. They'll still be like, yeah, I know some people are just more outgoing than other people, and some people are more quiet and reserved, and but I don't know what that's about. And extroverts might kind of be like, yeah, well, I don't understand those quiet people, like what's wrong with them, right? They're weird. And introverts will kind of be like, those like outgoing people, they're dumb, you know? People are still gonna notice the differences. They just won't have a word, they won't have a term to use for it, to describe it. And nowadays, when we use those terms, we understand that, okay, like this is what introverts need and this is what extroverts need, you know? And I feel like maybe that's better than having these differences but not having a way to research it, not having a way to describe it, and not really understanding what's going on and why. Because at least when you understand what's going on, you can also use it for good things. For example, sensors and intuitives, there's this thing going on where apparently like a lot of intuitives would go to university because their understanding theories would be easier for them. But if you're gonna be like, oh yeah, sensors are dumb and intuitives are smart or something, and the same could be said for thinkers and feelers, right? How is that better? You know, I feel like I don't see how that's better. When I was in elementary school, people would they would say things like, I'm smart, and you know, and then some other kids, they're not smart, right? Yeah, how is that gonna help people, right? Now kids are just gonna grow up believing that they're not smart enough. And someone like me would grow up believing that I'm so smart and realizing that I'm not even working on my own weaknesses that the other kids were better at. Wouldn't it be better if we could say something like, okay, I'm an intuitive, they're a sensor, and we both have strengths, we both have weaknesses, instead of categorizing people in different ways. And sometimes maybe it's better to kind of be like, okay, yeah, this person, they're just this type, instead of being, yeah, this person, they're just weird. You know, like people are gonna notice differences anyway. And at least when they know that someone is just a certain type, then we can at least make people aware of the fact that that person who might seem weird because maybe they're a different type than you are, that there's not something wrong with them, that they also have their own strengths. Yeah, I know probably some people don't believe that and they're like, yeah, this function is useless, whatever, but once you actually understand the depths of each of these functions, you have to either realize that there's so much depth to them that none of them is useless, or you're just ignorant, or you just don't know enough about functions to realize that. But every function has a certain level of depth that no other function can reach, and that has its own usefulness. Okay, so I think that was most of what I wanted to say. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.